All right, everyone. Welcome to this very special live stream. Happy May Day. I'll just wait a few more moments here so that more and more can join the chat. It's a very lovely day in spring here. Okay. All right. Can you all hear me okay in the chat? Just let me know if everything's okay, if there's any echo. All right. Hapa Perspective is here. Hello, Hapa. All right. So let's go ahead and get started. So today, I'm very excited for this. Very much looking forward to this. We're going to be having a conversation about European traditions, European religion, and their importance in our modern day and age. My guest is someone who I've described as a linguist and a scholar, and I hope that's the most apt description. Later, our guest will tell us if I've got that on the money. He and I have been mutuals on Telegram for quite some time now, and I'm always keen to read what he has to say on any topic, really, but especially on philosophy, religion, and paganism. So I'm really pleased to welcome Hwitgeard to this live stream. Hwitgeard, thank you for coming on today. Please tell us a little bit about yourself, introduce yourself to the audience, and then we'll get started.
Thanks, Box Popular. Yeah, it's been a pleasure to be here. I began my channel about 2 years ago, shortly before the pandemic started, or the so-called pandemic. Initially, it's an extension of me posting various political memes and information and red pills and whatnot on my old Instagram accounts. And I seemed to burn a few bridges there. And eventually I felt it was important to go onto a new platform where I could be a bit more free. I didn't have to dress things up in euphemisms or skirt around the issue, so I could be a lot more open with what I was talking about. So I made a Telegram channel. I felt I could be a lot more anonymous there, and began a channel there. And initially it was called Hwitgeard, which is the Old Norse version of this name. And after two accounts eventually got blocked on device apps, eventually I made a third channel, which is this one, and I changed the name to Hwitgeard, which is Anglo-Saxon for white guard or white garden or a white enclosure. And it's literally a white yard. It's a space for white issues, really. And I felt that best described what I was talking about and what I could discuss. And those issues have expanded quite a bit. They've been a lot more broad since. I've taken a lot more of a wider interest in geopolitical issues, in some bits of economics here and there, but mainly focusing on history, linguistics, and paganism, of course, and all from a wider political perspective.
Fantastic, very good. Yeah, in my opinion, you're very knowledgeable on these topics. That comes across in pretty much every post you make on Telegram when these topics come up. But I also wanted to talk to you because you practice what you write about. I was going to say practice what you preach, but I won't use that idiom. But so I wanted to talk to you because I'm interested in practical things. Ever since I started my channel, that's something that I wanted to infuse every video with. I wanted to not just whinge about things, which is often all we can do. I didn't want to just diagnose problems, which is often all we can do in some cases. But I did want to, as often as possible, talk about some practical solutions or things that we can actually do. address the things that are in our own hands. So that's why I really wanted to talk to you about this, because you are a practicing pagan. Is that a term, by the way, that we should use? Is paganism an appropriate term? Is that a pejorative? What do you think?
Well, the term is it's historically developed as a contrast to Christianity, same as heathenism. While Christianity had the monopoly on being a much more urbanite, cosmopolitan religion, heathenism and paganism both meaning the same thing broadly. One of those who came from the heath and those who came from the pagus, respectively, refer to folk customs and folk traditions in the mind of Christians. So those who weren't invested in the new faith, they had no stake in the new religion, and in some ways the word becomes synonymous with Gentile. But we'll get into that later.
Yeah, definitely. Sorry, go ahead, continue.
Sorry. And in one sense, it can be pejorative, just because it's a word that's developed out of a contrast. It's like, but by default, it's a sort of very othering word. But I see no reason why people can't embrace the word and make it their own. But in general, paganism refers to any natural and more organic native religion. So the traditional religions of Africans can be considered paganism. Shintoism can be considered paganism. All the tribal traditions of South America can be considered paganism.
I quite like that it does refer to the sort of the more rural and country folk aspect, because I've been talking a lot about this, and I think many people in our circle have been talking about this a lot, as a means of detaching ourselves from a system which is clearly corrupt and in many cases malevolent towards us. One of the things that we might want to consider is going back into a more natural and rural lifestyle. And that is something that definitely appeals to me, and is something that I contemplate and think about working towards. So if the term paganism and heathenism describes that, I think it fits us quite nicely, actually.
Yeah, there seems to be quite a few levels to paganism. In its earlier stages, it seems to have been a lot more based around the family, around the home and hearth. And this is an issue that Numa Fustel de Coulanges speaks about. And that sort of very early, about in the ancient city, by the way. Initially, it begins as a much more family-oriented thing that's focused on ancestor veneration, and then it seems to expand. So it seems to run alongside the development of political states. No religion is separate from politics, so politics always describes the development of religion in its structure, in its growth, and paganism is no different. It begins in a much more family-oriented cult worship, where the paterfamilias is the head of the family, and also he's the practicing priest. And then, as that expands further into a state religion, you find further centralization. So you find that definitely in ancient Greece, where you find developments of certain gods start to take on a new particular role, like Athena as the centralization of Athens' democracy. And you certainly find this in a Germanic phase as well. The role of Woden. He seems to have taken on a much more centralized role that's taken aspects from various different gods. You find Zeus taking this central role in ancient Greece, and same with Jupiter. And the prominence of these gods can be described as political. Once there's a centralization of the city-states, that also involves the centralization of particular gods who act in a political role. They become fathers. They become leaders.
Mm-hmm. Okay. Well, I think that's an interesting point there about how the sort of the patriarch was the priest of the family, which is something that we're going to talk about later. So why don't we just dive right into some of the questions that I've got, and these are my questions. These are some of my curiosities that I've been exploring and I've been seeking answers to. Um, and so we'll talk for about an hour or so, maybe a little bit more. And then we'll leave about maybe like a half an hour for questions from the chat for the end. So if anybody in the chat has questions for my guest or for myself, save them for the end, write them in like all caps so I can see them. I have here, I'm looking at the chat, I'm looking at comments I think that are being posted on the YouTube chat. We are streaming on Odyssey as well, but I don't know if I can actually see any comments that are, it says here that some destinations you won't get comments. So apparently because Odyssey is an unknown destination, I don't get to see those questions. So I do apologize. This is my first ever multi-stream. It's only my second live stream. So I apologize for any hiccups. Hopefully I'll get better at this as I continue. So let's get started with my first question, Hwitgeard, which is how to practice paganism. I feel like, for me personally, there's so much forgotten and lost lore, and it can get a bit overwhelming at times, even if you are interested in this topic and you try to learn as much as possible. And then I also I'm a bit concerned with that, exploring and learning can turn into more of like a scholarly effort, more like an academic effort rather than actual faith. And there are so many gods, it can be hard to keep track of them all. Or if we are going to be honoring our ancestors, that adds even more people to the to the to the list, to the pantheon, I guess you could say. So and then another thing too is just the modern world is not very conducive to worshiping in the old ways. If we think about the destruction that has been wrought upon the natural world, it's quite severe. And for many pagan and European traditions and old religions, nature has a fundamental role to play. So tell us your thoughts and tell us about your lived experience, your practical experience with being a practicing pagan.
Well, as I said before, that there's various different levels to paganism, whether it becomes an official state religion or whether it's practiced more privately in the home. And at this point, it's definitely going to be something practiced more privately in the home. And of course, that's the importance of building new communities who can bring these practices, bring the traditions and rituals into a much more public and shared experience rather than something so private. But personally, for myself, it's mainly a private ritual. And yeah, the modern world isn't very conducive for it. Paganism is very much entrenched into its rituals connecting to the cosmic order. And one of the main things for that cosmic order and affecting it is ritual like sacrifice and prayer. And sacrifice and prayer are very much bound together in the same thing. If you were to pray to a god, you request something from them, and you have to offer something in return. You have to offer a sacrifice, and that's going to be very difficult to do compared to what sacrifice was in the past. Obviously, we can't do the same things. We've moved on morally from things like human sacrifice, so that's clearly not a possible issue, but we still need to perform particular rites that can affect the cosmic order. Any act of sacrifice must have a much more wider effect on that.
Mhm.
So I still perform prayers to the gods, depending on what I request from them, and just to acknowledge them, and also to my ancestors as well. So that's something that can be done in the privacy of your own home, and it's something that I would encourage more people to try to bring into a much more conducive environment. There's definitely more possibility for a religious experience to be felt in a much more natural environment, to be felt as rituals were performed in the past, in a forest or on a mountain. That's where the gods can appear to us. So it's much more natural environments, but are much more conducive to ritual circumstances. And unfortunately, the greater industrialization of the world is slowly eroding those natural environments and making it very much difficult to practice.
Yeah, I feel that as well. And one thing I would like to add is that with this conversation in particular, I'm not so interested in obviously imposing paganism on anyone. This is something that I'm interested in talking about. I also one of my motivations for having this conversation is to remember our traditions. I think it's a very very good omen that we're having this conversation on May Day, the 1st of May, which has just such a rich history of European tradition. This day has become secularized. It has become Christianized in some parts of Europe, but this is one of the most important days in the traditional European ethno-faiths calendar. And so one of the things that I want to keep in mind is not, even for those of us in the audience who might not be pagan or might not be interested in practical ways of practicing, but I do think that it's worth remembering our traditions. It's worth remembering our culture and how where we come from and why we do certain things, and it's worth knowing what some of the symbols represent, and we see these symbols in our art and architecture, and so many of our major holidays are still infused with these symbols and the ancient meanings. So I think it's still worth it to talk about this and to keep the flame of these traditions alive. You mentioned that you have some rituals, and you do pray to the gods and the ancestors. So one other question I had, sort of like as a follow-up within this first question, is many Christians, for example, believe that they have a personal relationship with their deity, whether it's Jesus Christ or God the Father, Yahweh, which there's obviously kind of one and the same according to the Trinity, and they can communicate with him in any situation, whether they're at a red light in traffic and they can just have a prayer, or whether they are making the sign of the cross before they step foot on a football pitch, that sort of thing. Is that something that you can do with paganism, or do you need to have more of a ritualistic process?
I think that it's more important to be in an environment that is more conducive for the gods to appear and reveal themselves. There's a lot more immanence with the gods than the transcendence that you get with Christianity and Abrahamism as a whole. So the idea that God is everywhere and you can just summon him or invoke him at any particular time, that seems a lot more it seems that it follows the transcendental ideal of God, rather than the immanence of the gods, who are much more active within the world, and in that way they need to be revealed in the right environment. So it's not that they wouldn't listen in if you were just walking onto a football pitch or while you're driving your car. It's that it just wouldn't seem to be the right environment in which to do it. It wouldn't.
Okay. Well, on that theme,
I'm
of environment, I'm sorry. Go ahead. Go ahead.
That what's important is that the world is divided into sacred and profane areas, and certain areas must be sectioned off or specifically designated as being holy in order for the gods to appear in that way. So there's a lot more, a much more sacred environment that's conducive to the gods must be made holy first, rather than just a much more profane or material world where the gods where God is the only thing that can be sacred other than a church. There can be lots more sacred locations and environments in the natural world, but that needs to be specifically designated first.
Okay. So on this theme, this is something that I'm really interested in, and it will definitely segue very nicely into my second main topic of questioning. I definitely feel the allure of nature. I definitely feel a connection to nature, and I always have since I was very small. Nature, it inspires my imagination. It sets it on fire. I feel things in nature. I don't know. I just feel like my senses are more are keener, and I definitely feel. I notice when I spent too much time away from nature. But my question is, some pagan religions, some traditional European religions, weren't so connected to nature. So, for example, and this is sort of getting into my second question, which I will make clear in a moment. But if you were to compare like Greco-Roman traditions and religion with Germanic, I mean, even the Romans themselves, I think they kind of even admired. I think Tacitus writes about how he admired how the Germanic peoples left their gods free in nature to walk around free in the forests and in the hills, whereas the Greco-Romans built temples, and they were temples of stone, and their gods. I think even Tacitus says, how he described how the Germanic peoples let their gods roam free in the woods and in nature, as opposed to imprisoning them in statues. Now, I think maybe he was just being poetic. I'm not sure if they actually, believe that their gods were inside of the statues. I think they were meant to be representatives of what they're worshiping, just like you would, have as Jesus on a cross, etc., or like we've just had in Spain during Semana Santa, these great pasos, they're called, these very ornate, decorative, artistic creations depicting scenes of the Passion of the Christ. So, what do you think about the line between nature and temples? What should someone who might want to practice the Greco-Roman traditions, because that's his ethnicity and that's what he seeks to reconnect with, what then can he do when in that tradition it's more important to be inside of a temple of stone rather than a forest?
Well, linguistically, the word templum, from where temple comes from, it's connected to words like allegedly to the word time in English, and Greek daemon, all these words refer to something that's separated or cut off. And the importance of a temple, obviously, the state of other stone temples in the golden age of ancient Greece, and then later in Rome as well. This is it's a development over a long period of time. So same as stone churches as well. They would have began as much more primitive structures. They would have began as being made out of wood, and then even before that, they would have been just a part of a wooded area that's been partitioned, possibly by things like fire torches that can create a specific cut off or section of this place is deemed holy compared to the much more secular part outside of it, or the profane part, really. So I think it's more just a development of an older theme, really. That it's not that the gods are imprisoned in a stone temple. It's more that that's the development of a specific cut-off and holy environment, and that's why temples are sacred, because they are holy spaces. And it's more important to designate holy spaces, whether they are indoors or outdoors, as long as they can be separated, cut off, and divided from that which is not holy. And I think that's the more important point. I think that during Tacitus's time, he would never have even experienced a much more primitive version of a temple. So he would have no margin of comparison to speak about.
Yeah, that's a good point. I wonder, Romulus and Remus would have been honoring the Roman gods, but they hadn't founded Rome yet. So obviously there was a way to honor the Greco-Roman gods without having to live in an urban, civilized, quote unquote, compared to the Germanics in the forest and stuff, urban scenario, and with grand temples of stone. And the reason I asked, specifically citing like the Greco-Roman traditions, is that another question that comes to my mind as I've been delving into this is, what should Europeans of mixed ethnicity like myself do? Because on my mother's side, I'm Gaelic and British, and I definitely feel a connection to that side of my blood, to that lore. I understand the appeal and the allure of those green isles and all of the mystery on them and within them. And I feel, and it's been ever since I was very, very small. Like I used to listen to traditional Celtic folk music when everyone else was listening to pop songs and whatnot. And I could, even though I had never been to these places, I was imagining them. Like the blood memory of my Gaelic and British side is, I think, really strong. And unfortunately, I think a lot of particularly Celtic, Gaelic, and Welsh, which is my ethnicity, lore and traditions, mythology has been lost. And I know there's been revival moments, and I know there's been resurgence of interest in things, but compared to the fame of the Nordic pantheon or the Greco-Roman pantheon, the Celtic one seems a bit pale in comparison. It seems like it has been a bit forgotten, which is unfortunate. So that's something that I have to rediscover if I choose to. But my question is then, what do I do about my Italian side? Because my father is Italian. So on that side, my traditional ethno-faith would be Greco-Roman. Can or should I pick one and abandon the other? Or can or should I mix them? Is that something that would be appropriate? And the reason why this question is important for me, and I think you would agree, and that one of the main reasons why we're having this conversation, is that we are trying to rediscover something that many, if not most, other peoples on Earth have, or at least have had up until very recently, with globalization being more and more of a threat, which is a religion that is connected to their ethnos and their traditions and their culture. And I am convinced that one of the best ways to resist globalization, resist the New World Order, resist global homo, whatever term you want to use, is to maintain the flame of your ancient traditions and the ones that are specific to your people, specific to your ethnos. But that kind of raises a problem for people of mixed ethnos. So I know that I'm not alone in being of mixed European ethnicity. So what do you think about this? Am I making a mountain out of a molehill? Is this really not as complicated as I perceive it to be, or not? Like, what do you think about this scenario?
Well, there's quite a few things to say about this. I definitely agree that paganism is an ethnic faith. I remember Stephen McNallen's book, Asatru, a European native religion, and he gives the comparison of Native Americans and that, well, Amerindians, and a lot of Americans were LARPing as Native Americans. They were pretending to have their traditions, and it just seemed disingenuous to take aboard someone else's faith, someone else's background, someone else's ethnicity. And he used that as an analogy to discuss why Europeans should embrace their own. They shouldn't try and pretend to take on someone else's ethnic background, someone else's traditions, someone else's gods. They should embrace their own and see themselves as ethnic. And that it's quite unfortunate that most Europeans don't see themselves as an ethnicity. They see ethnic as something other that other people are, whereas we see ourselves mainly as some sort of basic standard. And that's very much unfortunate because we need paganism more than ever to reassert and re-embrace our own ethnicity. We're seeing the very concept of white being erased and being told that we don't exist, that our history doesn't exist. And our ancient traditions are very much part of that. For example, I see the backlash that's been happening to the Northmen recently, and that's just a film. And you can see that even things in pop culture and media seem to, you can see that it stirs something in people. But for me, the ethnic issue is the entire telos, the entire purpose of paganism. For me, I believe in paganism because it's something that points towards my own ancestry and my own. It's an ethnic faith that aims at the purpose of the continuation of the ethnic faith. It's not something that you can believe in because you just want to. I'll talk on Christianity later, but like a revealed religion, the purpose and telos of Christianity is salvation from death, and this is something that it's something that's quite modern and can only emerge out of the sort of cultural background that you had in the cosmopolitan Roman Empire. It's something that's very cosmopolitan, and I think that as we're entering a much more existential crisis, the purpose of having a religion that conquers death or conquers sin just seems pointless. If we're looking down the barrel of extinction, having an ethnic faith is a lot more important. But on the issue of mixed ancestry, I think there's obviously two sides to it. There's a lot more local scale, which is inter-European mixing, as it is with you, and obviously there's the international and intercontinental scale where you'll have people of African descent who are trying to claim that we was Vikings.
Exactly.
Things like that. But this is part of the problem because with trying to bring paganism back to the modern world, what we find is that we're dealing with fossils now. were
Hmm.
essentially digging up academic reconstructions, where trying to bring things from history books back to life. And the point is that paganism is a lived religion. It's meant to be living in the present. And I think that this issue of mixing was something that happened quite regularly in the ancient world. You found that the Roman Empire would adopt foreign gods from various different countries. You found a lot of cross pollination in traditions and practices between the Anglo Saxons and the Celts inhabiting Britain, even though
Hmm.
the Celts were Christian at that time. They still continued a lot of traditions, including the burying of swords in water sources like lakes, and you found a much more a lot of common traditions and practices happening like that. So I think that we need to stop seeing paganism as a fossil and see it as a lived religion, something that where this degree of overlap can happen. And I think in terms of your mixed ancestry, I see no problem in um, why you can't share in elements of both.
Okay.
It
Yeah,
only might
there's
seem like
a Woodlander says that if you go back far enough, there's very little difference between Celts and Indo-European Mediterranean peoples. And I mean, even
exactly.
according to Gaelic mythology, the Tuatha De Danann, or the Danann, I don't know how exactly what is the most accurate pronunciation, but they were the sort of the pantheon, the Gaelic pantheon. But the Gaels themselves, according to their mythology, came to Ireland via Iberia. So there is obviously these these peoples did move from different places around the European continent, and obviously we know that there is overlap and there are shared um, traditions, and we know obviously that a god like Zeus is Jupiter, or in Greek, and then Jupiter in Roman, and then his equivalent might be, I believe his equivalent is Thor in the Nordic tradition. Um, so there definitely is overlap. My question, or what I wonder to myself, is how does that work in practice? Um, would I pray to a Greco-Roman god on certain occasions, and then a Celtic god on another occasion, or would it be appropriate to mix them regardless of the occasion? Because I am loath to separate or abandon one in preference for the other. I feel like that would be like cutting off part of my soul. Um, and this is something that is difficult for a person of mixed ethnicity to bear, which is why, ideally this would happen very infrequently. But in my case, it did. I can't do anything about it, obviously. So, what do you think about that then? Like in practice, practically, how would this mix play itself out in a daily life situation of someone who wants to carry on these traditions and these practices?
I think in practice, this sort of conflict wouldn't really arise. You find a lot of again, a lot of the prominence of these gods are quite political. Um, the prominence of Zeus and the prominence of Jupiter, these are high state gods, but for the most part, a lot of normal people, a lot of peasants and farmers, their main concern would be with their ancestors, with smaller house gods that unfortunately are completely lost to history. So you
Mhm.
find a much more wider variety, and these house gods would have had a much more impact, or a much wider impact on people's daily lives.
Mhm.
But that's again the problem of not having a living religion and dealing with fossils. But
Yeah.
this sort of organic development that you would have had of various different gods of different backgrounds, um, they would have intermixed. Um, you'd have had Celts borrowing a Roman god and giving them their own special special title to address their particular function.
Mhm.
And you find a lot of different epithets applied to different gods that give them special distinctions, and these end up being borrowed. For example, some of the features of Woden seem to have been borrowed from a Roman cult of Mercury, especially as his role of I must say psychopomp, a leader of souls, and that definitely played a large role in the development of Woden as leader of the souls in the Wild Hunts. So there's definitely
Mhm.
a development of a Mercury cult crossover of where elements of one god will impact another in a different people's culture. And that sort of organic development would definitely have happened between a Celtic and Roman crossover. So
Well,
if
I'm
it
very
lived,
pleased to know that. Then that's good. So you mentioned earlier about how in the private home, before these religions became um, more
more complex.
more complex and more intertwined with the politics of the state, that basically the patriarch was, quote unquote, the high priest. So I wanted to get your thoughts on something else that often comes up whenever these discussions arise, um, which is the structure or lack thereof. So on one hand, you have those who might argue for the necessity of structure and organization and a priestly class. And then on the other hand, and this is whether we're talking about um, European traditional religions and ethnofaiths or even Christianity, Catholicism, this is, I think, central to the debate between Protestants and Catholics, is the central figure of the Pope and the wise priestly class who knows more than the laity. So what do you think about then? That on one hand, there are those who might argue for structure and organization and a priestly class and how those things are necessary. And then on the other hand, you might have those who quite enjoy and celebrate the liberating sort of do-it-yourself paganism that European traditional ethnofaiths provide. Is there um, a, a balance between the two that we can find? Is it necessary to have a priestly class and some organization and structure, or is it okay to just go about this sort of as a willy-nilly, do it in your whatever you're doing in your private practice in the home is more or less okay? Or is that an erroneous mindset to have, and we actually do need some structure here? What do you think about this?
I think it's definitely erroneous to ignore the traditions as have been handed down to us. Um, Trying to rebuild it from the ground up and then using that as an excuse to just do what you want seems very modern, very foolish, and very very leftist.
Hmm.
I think it's more important to make sure that um, we can have obedience and structure. We can have order, and I think that's more important to make sure that we we revive our traditions in a way in which they would have been practiced in the past, obviously within the circumstances which we have now, but to make sure that they obey a much more hierarchical structure. Um, it can't just become some sort of free roaming LARPing. It needs to adhere to structure and order because
Hmm.
that's the only way in which a true spiritual discipline can be practiced.
Hmm. That's my sense as well, is that I think, you know, doing it in a sort of free for all, just do it your own way, is definitely the path that leads toward this sort of um, the type of paganism that's often and rightly mocked. And it's often the type that's practiced by what you said, like the sort of leftist types that practice it that way. And it does ring false what they're doing. It does ring hollow, much as in the way that the Anglican, the Church of England going completely woke, or the words of Pope Francis, just that sound like communist talking points, ring hollow. They don't seem like genuine reflections of those religious beliefs.
Yeah, it seems like that it becomes a pagan equivalent of Protestantism, and it just becomes anarchy.
Yeah. Okay, so I think it's this is one of the reasons why I want to have these conversations, because it's often said that we have better things to do with our time, we have more pressing issues to deal with, and why are we even worrying about this? But I think I said earlier, I think that this is one of the things that is in our hands, and it is a good way to resist globalization and the eradication of our identity, is to learn about as much as we can about our past, and try to revive it if it needs to be, and maintain it if it needs to be. And so I think it is useful to talk about this. So perhaps going forward, those of us who are, like yourself, really informed about this, and have dug into it at a scholarly level, I could think of many other names amongst our online community and such, who have done a lot of good work in this. I think going forward, then, that it would be useful to sort of start creating that kind of priestly class, and talk about, share information about how to practice these traditions, and maintain them, and do it in a way that is accurate, that is appropriate, and that isn't just sort of anarchy, as you said. What do you think about that going forward?
Definitely. I think as the problem seems to get worse for us, it reminds us of why it's difficult to practice paganism in the modern world. All the obstacles we're seeing now are making it pretty much impossible to practice. Literally, all the conditions that Agenda 21 would lay out seem to make it absolutely impossible. Imagine if you couldn't even light ritual fires, because wood burning becomes illegal as part of the green agenda. Just as an example, literally all the conditions that are changing now in the modern world, including hierarchical structure as well. All those are constantly being eroded. So when we make our own new communities, and separate ourselves from the system, those communities must have their own structures to them as well. And in practicing paganism, having that hierarchical structure would be very important in there.
Definitely. So then, talking about some of the difficulties that the modern world, the obstacles that the modern world puts in our path, for those of us who care about this, and would like to see our identities and our history and our culture maintained, and thrive even. Another one that came to me, another question that I grapple with, is that, okay, so we know about the different gods, and we know that we have to, in many cases, rediscover them, relearn about them, and then honor them in the appropriate ways. But then another fundamental part of traditional European religions and ethnofaiths is the honoring of our ancestors. And this is another obstacle that the modern world throws at us, is that how do we honor our ancestors when many of us might not even know who our great grandparents were or what they did? So what should we moderns do? What are your thoughts on this? I know these are some pretty big questions. So if I don't want to feel like I don't want you to feel like you're on a hot seat here. We're just sort of exploring answers to these riddles. But what should we moderns, who do seem to be cut off a bit from the family tree, like, I marvel sometimes when I read ancient texts, and it seems like the protagonist knows his lineage going back generation after generation, and not only he knows their names, but he knows their feats, he knows what they did, and he's inspired by that. But we moderns, like I said, we might not even know who our great grandparents were, what they did. So what do you think about addressing this obstacle?
Well, I think the fact that this problem even exists is a call to reconnect with people, reconnect with our families, get in touch with our grandparents, ask them about their experiences, about who their family are, reconnect with much more smaller communities. The purpose of a ethnic faith is, but it designates a particular in-group. It defines who we are compared to those who we aren't on a spiritual level. And even Christian kings of the past, they'd euhemerized certain gods as their ancestors. So certain kings would have claimed descent from Woden, and they didn't see him as a god, but they definitely saw him as a spiritual ancestor to them. And the same with the god Ing as well.
Mm-hmm.
And these ancestors, they determine who we are, and they give us a much more wider connection. And it's also important to know that it's not just our ancestry going back in one direction. It will split off in many different ways. And as a much more ethnic and quite a racial worldview, we should
Mm-hmm.
view a lot of people as our extended family. There's a much more ancestral connection to those of our own blood. And yeah, I'd say even if you can't remember who your ancestors were, and you can't trace it back very far, we could always look it up on genealogy websites and explore that. But if we don't know, I think it's just important to acknowledge them, recognize them, and feel their collective energy. I think a lot of people are so bogged down in individualism that
Mm-hmm.
they don't feel a sort of collective force with other people around them. There's a sort of psychological trapping that keeps them in their individuality. And if they can try to feel a much more closer connection to those of their own blood, then they feel that they aren't just atomized. They can feel that they're bound to other people. They can feel these people as their family. And I think that's important in ancestor worship, and not just in being able to claim your descent far back, but horizontally as well. Those who are right next to you, um, they can be your distant ancestors as well. There's a much more
Mm-hmm.
wider connection to those, and I think that sort of ancestral connection builds a community spirit. It builds a bond, and it builds a collective purpose as well.
Well, and that's such a good point, and that's why I don't shy away from this topic, and I do like to talk about this from time to time. I do think it's important because what we're talking about now is such a useful tool, if not even a sharp weapon, which we can use in the fight against atomization, globalization, and this is a way, this is a path that we can start walking upon to find out more about who we are and what our great grandparents were like, what they did, and then even going back further, this could be the inspiration that many of us need to start walking down this path. I think it has practical purposes, and because if you're not even in the mindset of thinking about your ancestors and honoring your ancestors, then this information will be lost to you. But if you start entertaining notions of the importance of traditional European ethnofaiths, and you come to the realization that actually no, our ancestors are very important and honoring them is fundamentally important, well, now you have opened up the gates to a very grand new world of exploring who you are and who your people are. And I think it's a great bulwark against atomization and extreme individualism that I think is definitely. I think we've all identified that. We are all sort of in this community world. We are all very much diagnostic doctors, and I think we have all, many of us, if not most of us, have identified this as a very serious problem. And so, if we want to look for solutions, I think this is one of them, and this is why I will continue talking about this, even if some naysayers might say, "Oh no, it's more important to talk about, I don't know, I guess, the black pills of the day or current headlines." Okay, so we've talked about the main three questions. I have one more that I want to talk about, and I think it's another good segue in that I've said I will continue talking about this despite the naysayers and despite some of the I guess infighting that can arise. So I wanted to ask this one to you, Hwitgeard. Why shouldn't we just be Christians? What's wrong with Christianity? Why are we having this conversation? Why aren't we just Christians? So let's talk about Christianity for a bit. What are your thoughts on Christianity and why it might not be the best for us?
Well, I have a very weird on-off relationship with this because I do enjoy, I have enjoyed in the past, especially criticizing Christianity when I used to be a atheist in the past. That got me into a lot of research in biblical history, in comparative mythology, especially in Mesopotamian history and mythology, and a lot of other theological studies and scriptural studies as well. So, but I think the much more pressing circumstances of where we are now, I think it's much more important to try and build a bridge with Christians and acknowledge that we need to put aside these constant arguments and infighting so we can focus on our much more existential threat of racial extinction. But with that comes the fact that this extension of the olive branch seems very much one-sided. On the one hand, we want to have that sort of that's a common connection. We want to be able to move forward, but non-Christians will always be failed Christians in their worldview. There's so this infighting will always continue, and while Christianity is very good for because it's essentially those who won in history, so it has power. But is that good, and is that power going to serve us well in the problems we're currently facing?
And who were the winners? If they won, who exactly were the winners? This is a question that
indeed
it's very uncomfortable. It's a very uncomfortable scab to start picking at. And to your point, I agree. I try to. My family are all Christian, and I'm, because of my Italian side, I'm familiar with Roman Catholicism, and then my mother's side is more Protestant. And when I was growing up in America, there was a spell where my parents sort of went into an evangelical arena. So I'm very familiar with Christianity, and I know many Christians. So occasionally, I will have to, take out the whipping stick and be a bit nasty, because what you said is that I see that the olive branch is one-sided, just as you said. Whenever I see nastiness, or whenever I see someone trying to stir the pot, or cause quote unquote infighting, it doesn't seem to be coming from the pagans. It seems to be coming from Christians, and I've seen Christians in our sphere saying things that I find very concerning, like, and I've even asked, in the event that we were to form our own communities, would you support a sort of imposition of Christianity? Would you want our independent parallel society to be Christian, or would you, be okay with living amongst non-Christians? Would you be okay with living amongst practitioners of European traditional ethno-faiths? And many times the Christians respond no. And in fact, they'll even get very aggressive, saying, I cannot abide it. I have to oppose anything that is not conducive to, the spreading of the word of God and the recognition of Jesus Christ as the way, the truth, and the light. And no one comes to the Father except through him. And so on occasion, I do admit to getting a bit angry with Christians, and I will make some Telegram posts that are perhaps, quite aggressive towards taking on Christianity. But I don't enjoy doing that. I would much rather maintain cordial relationships with Christians and just look at Christianity as something that can be criticized, and that doesn't mean that you're going after, because there are many good Christians in our community. I don't want to have problems with them, and there are some that don't have problems with the non-Christians and the pagans in our community. I think what's important is that we both agree that spirituality is very important. I think it's good that we agree on that. But yeah, I have just noticed that the Christians often do put their faith first, and I don't think that that's the most pressing threat right now. I know
Exactly.
Christianity gets made fun of by some people in Hollywood that like to make fun of it and disrespect it. I understand that,
But
and
it's
I know that. Go on.
it's for a particular reason, but they do so. As far as they're concerned, Christianity is a byword for people of European descent.
Well, exactly. They don't seem to have any problem with Christians in Africa.
Exactly.
They only seem to like to annoy and target European Christians. So it's, again, they see race first, but the European Christians still have blinders on when it comes to that. And another thing is that the Christians on our side, that they do put their faith first. They kind of have to if they want to be good Christians. And I know, like, church attendance is going down in some places in Europe, so they do feel like that's an important fight to wage. But if you were to look at it from a Christian perspective, Christianity is doing quite well in Africa. It's doing quite well in South America. I mean, the Pope they chose an Argentinian Pope for a reason. I believe that was a very well thought out choice, because they could see that would resonate excellently with the faith growing in Latin America. And I wouldn't be surprised if in the future we have an African Pope, which will also resonate very well with where Christianity is growing. And I think that an honest Christian would admit that actually that's great. That Christianity is growing in Africa. The more the merrier. The more souls, the more knees bowing and tongues confessing that Yahweh is King is great. I've come to the point now where I don't think that's quote unquote good for people of Europe. I don't want to get into too much of like the possibility that Christianity is one of the great psyops, one of the great conquests of all time. But I do feel like we have to find a way to reconcile with Christians and Christianity. It has proved to be a bit difficult, though. I'll give you the floor. What are your thoughts?
Well, in recent times, I've been trying to encourage Christians to look more into addressing their own problems. I think we're facing a much more important existential crisis in terms of the survival of our own people. And for that, we need to address the telos of Christianity. We need to ask what it's actually aiming towards and what its purpose is, because that seems a bit structural to kind of break it down into, well, what's the purpose of Christianity? But I think that's a very important question to be asking if that's going to be the leading religion as we're in order to help us against our future. And unfortunately, Christianity just seems to lead us back into civic nationalism all the time.
Mm-hmm.
And no matter how much you push forward, you get base Christianity. Somewhere down the line, you just get dragged back into civic nationalism over and over again.
Mm-hmm.
And it seems like it's something intrinsically built into it. And
well, yeah, I mean, it's in the Bible and I know Christians have responses to these, but I think the responses are usually lacking. And not to use modern vernacular, but it is a bit of a cope to say, oh, that's just a misinterpretation, or you don't understand the interpretation. But the Bible says neither Jew nor Greek, male nor female, everyone is a child of God.
Yep, that's Galatians 3:28.
Mm-hmm. And then the Bible is full of, even in the Old Testament, prophecies of that Yahweh and through the Moshiach will rule over the nations being us. If you read the Bible and you read, like I've gone back and read the Old Testament, when you read it through the eyes of someone who's racially aware and as a race realist, and you understand that, wait a second, every time it refers to the nations, that's my people. The God of the Old Testament is clearly our enemy, actually. So it is really, this is one of the hardest red pills for me to swallow, was this one. Even harder than certain things about, a certain war from the 20th century. Like, this was one that I was really not looking forward to having to admit some things about, because, like I said, all my family are Christian. I was raised Christian. I do believe that there is good in Christianity, just as there is often good in many religions. There's certainly beauty in Christianity, and I would much rather prefer to walk in the shade of a grand cathedral and not just be inspired by its beauty, but also, have that wonderful, beautiful monument resonate to me because it's my faith, it's my God. Obviously that would be lovely, but I have got to the point now where I have to say it when I look at, well, I'll tell you what, one of the reasons why I started getting a bit more critical and inquisitive about Christianity and its effects, and in many cases harmful effects on us Europeans, was over the past 2 years with the COVID stuff. I would have conversations with Christians. I would see what Christians were up to on various social media sites, and I was seeing a lot of they seem to like reveling in the oncoming apocalypse, and that it's like, hallelujah, it's the end times. And that was a bit strange. I mean, Christians tend to do this every so often, obviously. But it's always a bit like, it's a bit disconcerting to see that they're kind of like cheering on the destruction of the world. And of course they do, because they believe that the world is fallen. The devil is the king of the world, and we're all fallen beings. So, basically they can't wait for it to be obliterated. And I was also seeing in the sort of conspiracy areas of social media, the conspiracy areas of our community, a lot of these accounts that have hundreds of thousands of followers and subscribers, and they clearly have a Christian bend to them, were misinterpreting symbols. They were definitely clutching at straws. They were, in my perspective, they were showing a clear lack of understanding of what certain symbols mean. They were attributing to these symbols Christian morality, sort of almost like a very childish Marvel Comics, sort of like good and evil type of morality, where this symbol. We've even seen this with given the past 2 years and how important health and pharmacology has been, a lot of Christians were saying that just even looking at the symbol for pharmacies, which is the rod and the snake, well, that's clearly evidence of a demonic conspiracy, and that medicine is a demonic conspiracy. And I don't want to get into whether or not particular injections are bad for us. I think we all have our opinion on that. We're probably all on the same page. But just that the Christians were looking at the picture of the symbol of the rod and the snake and thinking that that's demonic because it has a snake on it, showing a complete lack of knowledge about what that symbol means according to Greek mythology, even according to biblical Hebrew mythology. That symbol appears in the Old Testament, and it's a symbol of healing. So I just started getting very concerned about how Christianity has the capacity to really lead us astray and commit lots of own goals even, and can be very harming towards us. And then that sort of opened up a wormhole into even more alarming information. So that's sort of where I was coming from regarding Christianity. And then more and more interactions with Christians. Like I could read things that I screenshotted of just like Christians saying things like, yeah, they would happily kill all of the pagans on the dissident right, or whatever you want to call it, once they get power, once they overthrow global homo and replace the ruling class with themselves, we're next. They would happily line us up, like a sort of Spanish Inquisition 2.0 and set us all on fire. And I just think, that then we're clearly not on the same side. We don't want the same outcomes. We don't have the same objectives at heart. And so this is becoming a bit more of a pressing issue. I feel like I've talked enough about that, so I'll throw it back to you.
But it goes back to that common saying: if all you've got is a hammer, everything becomes a nail. And in the view of many Christians, everything becomes the devil. Everything becomes a challenge to it, and it becomes very insecure. But the point you made about the purpose of it, and where it's going in terms of leading us, I've tried to encourage more Christians to confront the fact that it seems its general universalism is a product of the fact that it's built in history. Very few Christians would challenge the idea that Jesus really, really existed. He was a real historical person, and his miracles and actions on earth is proof that that it is the one true faith. Because unlike paganism, unlike all these myths where the word mythos from Greek has been reinterpreted as being a fake story, all these just become folk tales. They become stories that it's just myth. Whereas Christianity really, really, really happened in real-time history. And because of that entrenchment in history, especially a global shared history, that creates a meta-narrative structure that everyone in the world exists in. Or if they don't exist in, they will exist in that at some point once they become conquered and become told that they need to convert to the one true faith. Because, of course, if it's true, then not believing in it becomes a moral issue. Mm-hmm. Because how can you not believe something that's obviously definitely true? And because of this universalism, it creates a vector for globalism. Mm-hmm. And that seems to have created the circumstances of where we are now. From such a globalism and also a progressivism being based on the idea of progress and constantly moving towards a particular aim, all the other problems of the modern world seem to have come from that. And I feel that it's more important to try to break that sort of universalist and globalist, of universalism that has led to globalism, And unfortunately, that is that is one of the benefits of Christianity. It's been able to gain massive amounts of power by asserting itself in a universal way. It's centralized itself politically through a meta narrative of universal history. And we're going to have to, because that very centralization and universalism inevitably must lead to globalization. It creates a trajectory which always heads in that particular way, and globalism becomes inevitable because it creates this single single narrative of history where everything revolves around it like a central pole.
Well, it's even the utopia. It's even the great finale, the grand finale, according to the Christian story, is
Yeah,
globalism. And
exactly.
this was another thing that really started, gnawing at the back of my mind, and being one of those difficult red pills to swallow, was that as my motivations, my desires, my worldview became more traditionalist, more about the survival and thriving of the European peoples, to the point now where I wouldn't even describe myself as a nationalist, because I'm all for independent peoples breaking off and forming their own nations. Like I mentioned in a video I did a few months ago, that I don't actually oppose the Catalans wanting to break away from Spain, or the Cornish wanting to break away from the United Kingdom, or parts of northern Italy wanting to break away because they feel like they're more Germanic than they are Italic. Like I I kind of see that the great move of history since sort of like the Industrial Revolution, the creation of nation states, um, has been every time more and more centralized. The seat of power is further removed from the people. It's more distant, like physically distant from the people. Um, and then I started realizing that, if my position then is that I want to preserve traditions, I think traditionalism is a great way to fight against globalization, global homo degeneracy, etc. All the things that we've identified as ills. Then what do I do about a religion that strives for a world where everyone will worship one God, practicing one faith, every knee will bow, every tongue will confess, and then to make matters even worse, this religion comes from those who pretty much everyone on our side recognizes as um, a community which is often against us, which is often what can I say? It's not usually the we have a very complex relationship with this community, a very love-hate relationship with this community. And when you read someone like what is the name? Ravage is his last name.
Yes,
Um,
I did note down Ravage in my notes
yeah,
to quote him, but
what he says, when if you have we have torn down your idols, your statues, your heroes, they've all been replaced by a Hebrew maiden is your perfect image of femininity. A Hebrew carpenter is your god. Um, Yahweh, the God of the Hebrews, the Israelite God is now your God. That is a theological, philosophical, cultural conquest, the likes of which I don't think has ever been seen. I don't think there's anything comparable, and that's kind of what Ravage says, that there's
yeah,
been nothing like it, and
and,
that doesn't
as you said,
sit well with me. And I can see that he's right, and I can
yeah,
see that the Christians actually don't seem to bother because they've been. I don't want to use the word brainwashed. That sounds a bit unfair, but what else can I say? What word can you use to describe people who genuinely desire that all of the world bows down and worships and practices one faith? like to me, and that one faith be of Yahweh and of this God that, if you read the Old Testament, doesn't seem to like us very much. Um, but that's fine. I mean, you would expect the Hebrews to have a chauvinistic, ethnocentric God, just as the Greeks do, and as the Romans do, and as the Norse do. Okay, but then you wouldn't expect then the Hebrews to start bowing down and worshiping Norse gods, but we've done that for them, and it's very, very concerning. I mean, I just think there's nothing more incoherent than a Christian who rants and rambles against globalization when one of the fundamental pillars of the Christian utopia is globalist in its nature. Go ahead.
Oh, sorry. I was going to say before, but Ravage brags about how it was done without weapons, and yeah, I do find it quite interesting. But of all the different, because obviously Christianity, it does have many European elements. It does take a lot of influence from Neoplatonism, especially the Hellenized Jews who were living in Alexandria, like Philo. He was a massive influence on Christianity's doctrine, and the whole development of Christianity evolved as a separate sect of the Essenes, who were much more open to the idea of allowing Gentiles into their in-group. But I do find it quite interesting that of all the different syncretized cults that existed in the early Roman Empire around that time, you could have had Mithraism, you could have had Osiris or Horus cults, all these different cults that were quite cosmopolitan and shared across different nations and much more mixed populations, especially. So, of all the ones which could have been the global faith, why did it happen to be the one that was of the Hebrew God? That just sounds very, very
suspicious. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, exactly.
And then when you think like what I said earlier about how it's so incoherent, I think it's getting increasingly difficult to deny that in the globalist future, that people like this Noah Harari guy, the whether you want Santa Claus, Anal Schwab, right? These people, some of them might not have very strongly held beliefs. Some of them might do, but to the extent that they have beliefs and they have a vision, I think it's increasingly difficult to argue that their vision is not one of one language, one religion, one world, one people. There's no racial distinction. There's no religious distinction. There's no linguistic distinction. We've all become one. It's everywhere, and we've seen this being promoted now for decades. And then you look at what is sort of the Christian utopia, what is prophesied in the Old Testament. You look at some of even the words of Jesus Christ himself, and I don't see much difference between the two visions. And so, as someone who cares about genuine diversity, as someone who, one of the reasons why I traveled around Europe and wanted to do that was because I wanted to see with my own eyes and taste with my own taste buds and speak with my own mouth with people from all over Europe and enjoy this wonderful tapestry, true diversity. And I see that it's under threat. I want it to survive. I want to do what I can to preserve it. So Christianity poses a problem.
Yeah, absolutely. I agree with that. I've traveled quite a bit around Europe, and I really want to experience and see different cultures, different people in the world, and not just in Europe. I'd love to travel to Africa, travel to the Middle East, some countries in the Middle East anyway.
Yeah.
Travel to South America. I'd love to see native peoples in their own traditions, in their own way of life. And as you said, it becomes a wonderful tapestry. It becomes a world
and think
of
just how much knowledge and wisdom we've lost and are still losing because those native faiths are increasingly going extinct or on their last legs. I just think it's such a shame, and it's a great sadness. Actually, I feel sad about this.
So,
Yeah. Okay. So, Hwitgeard, I will give you the last word just to make any final thoughts that came to you during this conversation, and then we will have a bit of a Q&A. I'm going to try and keep this to 2 hours. If there's not many questions, then we'll call it a day, and we'll finish the conversation. We'll finish the stream. So, my friend, go ahead and share with us any final comments, final thoughts you have, and then if there's any questions, we'll go ahead and take a look at those. If you do have questions, chat, do send them in all caps so I can spot them easier, and then we'll go from there. So take it away, my friend.
okay. Well, just on the previous topic, I do think that there is quite a distinction between two different sides of Christianity. This is a point that I've mentioned before. That there is a religion of the book, and the religion of the book ties Christianity to its particular Semitic roots, especially because it keeps it chained into history. But there is also a much more lively, living religion in Christianity. It's definitely adopted a lot of former pagan traditions. Currently, it's the living faith for a lot of people. It's still alive. It's not fossilized, and I think that's the appeal for a lot of people because they want a living culture. They want a living religion. They want something that they can see around them. They can see the churches around them. They can see the history around them. They want something that's alive and shared with other people, and that's definitely the if I was to become Christian, that would definitely be the appeal to me. The fact that it's there, it's alive, it's around us, it's a real thing, and a lot of people don't want to abandon that because why would they want to if it requires a lot more work to try to revive paganism and make that something living? So I'm not saying that they choose the easy option, but it's definitely something that it gives it a lot more validity, knowing that it's around them. And I think that this distinction between the religion of the book and the religion of tradition presents different behavior for Christians. According to the religion of the book, Christianity should be very life averse. It should view the world around us as being evil, and we should look forward more to the kingdom of heaven, which is the true worth of things. And of course, that isn't true. That for a lot of Christians, they are very life affirming. You can tell this in the approach towards abortion that isn't just founded in scripture. They know full well that such a position to have is based on a very pro-life, very life-affirming view, and you don't need to have scripture to justify that. So, for a lot of Christians, they tend to there's this distinction between what's theoretical and what's real, how they should act. And for a lot of Christians, they do act more pagan than most pagans because they are living they're living their faith in their actions, in how they raise their families, in raising good, strong, stable families, and even the continuation of paganism in saints and how we celebrate particular calendar dates. Christianity has preserved a lot of paganism, so I can't fault Christianity entirely and blame it when it preserves a much more naturalistic and a much more pagan ethos, which is living in the world. But I think that unfortunately, because of its dependency on its scripture, it gets dragged back into a whole different world. And I do feel that a lot of Christians are having this internal struggle between two different worlds. And as we move closer towards a much more existential threat, the death of our race and the death of the European people and our way of life, we need to ask, what is the purpose of our religion? It needs to define a particular in-group and be able to work for the benefit of that particular in-group, rather than be so accommodating and so inclusive that such practices will end up being our end. And I think that for this, there needs to be a lot more community dialogue between Christians and pagans to be able to work towards that common end. We need to focus on that common purpose. We need to focus on that particular telos, which is the survival of our people. And for that, I think Christianity needs to make a lot of amendments to itself. It needs to look into what it's doing. And I'm not telling Christians that they need to give up their religion, or they need to turn towards paganism, but they definitely need to assess what the purpose of it is and how that can affect us going forward.
Well said. I agree, and that's something that I've even experienced I've experienced some pushback in different arguments and discussions with Christians, is that when I speak of practicalities and practical purposes for a religion, I get a lot of pushback, as if the Christians have divorced any sort of practical purpose from religion. You can't have, for example, political practicalities or political purposes attached to your religion. You can't have your religion have any sort of practical motivations or reasons to be, which I think is just historically untrue as well. I think you can see through the history of Christianity, even there have been numerous occasions in which the religion was tweaked or adapted or modified for entirely practical reasons. And whether it's to appeal to more people, attract more believers, whether it's to clarify certain doctrine, like the Council of Nicaea. In many occasions, these tweaks and modifications had disastrous results. I don't think you can find. I think you'll find many Catholics who believe that Vatican II was disastrous, had disastrous effects. But this idea that there can't be anything practical, if I were to say, look, I think we need to re-examine Christianity, and I think we might need to re-examine the value of paganism because there's some practical good here, I get pushback on that, and I think that's an error. But we're committing an error, especially when, as you said, the crisis is getting to existential levels. If not, it has already crossed that barrier. Okay, well, thank you very much, Hwitgeard, for joining me on this live stream. I really enjoyed it. I think the chat enjoyed it as well. Let's take a look at some questions here. This one says, only a powerful spirituality can repulse bureaucratic market totalitarianism. Can paganisms and ethno-faiths summon this magnitude of spiritual strength? Liberal ontology is wicked but formidable. So what do you think about that question, Hwitgeard?
Well, in the point that I made towards the end, that a lot of people choose the side of Christianity because it's still a living religion. Another point that I should have added to that is that it possesses power. It possesses power because of its centralizing meta-narrative. And this becomes a very difficult decision now, because we're essentially in a situation of an arms race. It's like on the topic of deindustrialization. You can't deindustrialize and go back, because if you do, you become weak, and then someone else will conquer you. So we are now in the religious centralization arms race, where if we were to roll back the centralizing power of Christianity, return to paganism, return to a much more pluralized worldview of different ethnic religions and different peoples, that makes us weak and able to be conquered. So it raises the question: can we only move in one direction? Can we only go one way? Is there any way of going back? But unfortunately, moving forward will lead to globalization. It will lead to our deaths. So we become trapped in a sort of situation where we need to develop more practical solutions. We need to work towards our ethnic people, and if we can do that with the centralizing power that Christianity has, that can be the best of both worlds. And that's the reason that we need to have this common ground. We need to have ethnic separation and a different pluralized, a much more pluralistic view in terms of that.
Mhm.
But we need to have the centralization of power as well. So if we can find a way that uses both, then that will be a practical solution against that.
Sure. Okay, here's a question. It's very open. Stephen Otero says, what about Gnosticism? Okay, so what about it? Hwitgeard, what do you think?
Well, I read a lot on Gnosticism when I was younger. I think there's definitely a place for it, but I'm not a fan of its general life aversiveness. It seems very introspective and navel gazing. It's very much sort of turned away from the world, and for that, I don't really appreciate that. I think that we need to turn much more towards the world rather than away from it. I think that, but if it can develop a lot more spiritual strength, if it can teach us anything, if it can give us something practical to use, then I'll happily see it having. Well, I would appreciate it in that sense.
Okay. All right, everyone. I don't see many more questions, so it looks like we're going to approach the end of this stream. Again, thank you, everyone who tuned in. I hope that I didn't miss any comments or questions from Odyssey. Later on, people can get in touch with me on my Telegram if they are so kind and help me sort this out, because I wasn't able to have Odyssey on at the same time as StreamYard without provoking an echo. So I didn't have Odyssey open. I'm just looking at my StreamYard, and the comments that StreamYard allows me to see are only coming from YouTube. So hopefully, if I do another stream, maybe I'll do streams every Sunday. Maybe that could be something. I don't know. I'll have to think of some things here, but I do want to support Odyssey and promote Odyssey. So I apologize if I didn't see anything posted there. I just don't know how to do it without provoking an annoying echo and ruining the stream for everyone. But in any case, I think this went very well. Special thanks to our special guest, Hwitgeard, for lending us his time and his knowledge and his perspectives. Hwitgeard, it was a pleasure.
Thank you. Likewise, it's been an absolute pleasure to be on. I've really enjoyed it. This has been my first live stream, so hopefully more in the future. And yeah, thank you very much for having me on. And thank you to everyone who listened.
And you all can find Hwitgeard on Telegram. Just type in his name, which is on displayed on your screens now. I don't think there's any other Telegram channels that have that name, so he'll be easy to find. And we will see you all next time. Thanks, everyone. Enjoy the rest of your May Day. Goodbye.